This talk is basically split into two. In the first half of the talk, I will cover the Moorish invasion, occupation and legacy in Spain. A lot of you will know much about this already, but the historical context is very important before we start to take a look at the life and times of our main protagonist today, Azraq, a Moorish warlord, wazir or caudillo, who lived most of his life in the high mountains of the Marina Alta, which is the area you can see on the map on the left of the screen. Firstly, a little about me and my credentials to give such a talk. I have a degree in history, albeit many years ago, from the University of Lancaster. I didn't, however, study any Spanish or medieval history, but since moving to Spain in 2016, myself and my wife Marina have taken a keen interest in Spanish history and culture. In 2021, we attended the University of Castilla-La Mancha in Toledo for their course on Moorish Spain, organised in conjunction with the Cervantes Institute and delivered by top professors from Spanish universities in Spanish. We followed that up the next year with the second part of that course. In 2023, again in conjunction with the Cervantes Institute, we completed a similar course in the history of Al-Andalus at the University of Granada. Some of the material you will see in the presentation is taken from those courses, especially for the historical context bit at the start. Most of the work on Azraq himself is personal research of the few secondary sources available about him. There isn't a lot in English, so it's been quite a journey reading historical accounts of his life in Spanish and even Valenciano. Before we look at the Moors, it's important we know a little about the peninsula prior to the invasion. One interesting way to approach this is to look at the various names that were given to the region over time. The Phoenicians, one of the first groups to settle the peninsula, named it Ispahan, the land of rabbits. That was mainly because rabbit was a staple food of the local population and was also used in clothing and to adorn clothing as well. The Greeks, active in the region from 500 BC, called it Iberia, probably from the river Ebro or Iberus. From 200 BC to 500 AD, the Romans governed the region and Latinized the Phoenician name and called it Hispania. The Visigoths, who ruled the region prior to the Moor invasion, had a tradition of distributing the lands of conquered regions amongst their nobles. The noble who got Spain in the raffle considered himself very lucky and in Germanic terms called it Land Lus, the lucky land. That later morphed into Al-Andalus. The Visigoths originated from the Black Sea area and after sacking Rome established a capital in Toulouse, but later moved that to Toledo. Whilst in the Land Lus, they converted to Roman Catholic. They never integrated with the local Ibero-Romano population and a little like the English invasion of Ireland were seen as an occupying military and governing force. There was no mass Visigoth migration to Spain. The term Moor originates from the Latin Mauri, describing the area called Mauritania, which runs from Algeria along the north of Africa to the Atlantic coast. I don't like to use the term Muslim, as it implies there was a religious motive for the invasion, which there was not. Arab is a description of people from a higher social class from the Arabian Peninsula. Early phases of the invasion were led by Arabs, with a North African or Moorish contingent of foot soldiers. In later centuries, however, the North African influence became more dominant. But why did the Moors expand across North Africa? Our conventional image is that Islam was a violent, aggressive movement aimed at world domination. In reality, military conquest normally followed after trade was established. After the death of Muhammad in 632 and the establishment of the pilgrimage to Mecca, social relations and trade began to develop, and a movement out of people from Mecca started. Across North Africa, the only real military aspect was the struggle against Roman Byzantium and the seizure of Carthage in 698 and Tangier in 708. Virtually everywhere the Muslims went, the people regarded them as fair and just and an upgrade on the previous rulers. So why the great leap across the Mediterranean? Of course it wasn't such a great leap. The two coastlines of Gibraltar and North Africa are visible from each other, and trading relations had long been established. There had also been minor Moor incursions into Spain. The Moors knew Spain was a land of mountains, and that where there are mountains, there are rich mineral deposits, metals, and water. There was a lot of disenchantment with the Visigoth rulers, both amongst the Visigoth nobility and amongst the local Ibero-Romano population. Recent research has shown that there was a climate crisis in Spain from 695 to 725, and it was claimed in the Moss-Arabic Chronicles of 754 that in the years just prior to the Moorish invasion, half the population of Spain had perished due to famine and bubonic plague. Indeed, the Chronicles of Alfonso III, the King of Leon in the 9th century, wrote that the Goths perished part by hunger and part by the sword. Onto the invasion itself, Tariq ibn Ziyad invaded with a force of 7,000 mainly Berber tribesmen and defeated a 33,000 strong Visigoth force. They actually used the ships of a rebel Visigoth lord in Quetta to cross the Mediterranean. There are various estimates of the forces. Moorish accounts of the time talked of a 100,000 strong Visigoth army. Gibraltar as we know it today means Mountain of Tariq in Arabic. If you read most accounts of the invasion, you will be told that the Visigoths lost at the Battle of Guadalete. However, research by military historians in the last year suggests that the battle took place much closer to the coast at Fasinas, close to Algeciras and some 100 kilometres from Guadalete. King Rodrigo of the Visigoths was betrayed by his own nobles who switched sides during the battle. The next year in 712 a more serious force arrived. An Arab-led 18,000 strong army landed and both armies embarked on their journey north. By 718 only Asturias, Cantabria and the Basque country was still under Christian rule. The Moors were defeated in Asturias at the Battle of Covadonga in 718, but then continued their push further north into France until finally being defeated at the Battle of Poitiers in 732. But how were they able to move so fast? Firstly, they could thank the Romans and the fine network of roads that they left behind. The Moors had a large cavalry force, and from Persia they'd taken the stirrup, enabling them to ride quicker, further, and with more comfort. They were largely welcomed by the indigenous population, who had no loyalty at all to the Visigoths. As for the Visigoths themselves, they were divided. Their leaders were largely extinguished in the early battles, and so they preferred peace treaties and vassalage to fighting. The Christian chronicles of the time, largely written by clerics, talk of the ferocity and cruelness of the Moors. In fact, it was largely a peaceful takeover. One contemporary source is the Treaty of Tudmia, signed in Orihuela in 713, where the Moors were allowed to peacefully take over the regions of Alicante and Murcia, and Christians and Jews there could live peacefully as long as they paid a tax. There were other such treaties across the country. Some non-Muslims saw the benefit of converting. Those who didn't were, under the Quran, given certain freedoms as long as they paid the tax. They were known as al-Kitab, or people of the book. A very strict social hierarchy existed. First place Arabs, second Berbers, third converts, fourthly Christians and Jews, and in fifth place slaves. I'd like just now to go through the major phases of the Moorish occupation. Between the years 711 and 756, Al-Andalus was a dependency of the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus. In 750, the Abbasids violently overthrew the Umayyad Caliphate. In a particularly chilling episode known as the Banquet of Blood, almost all the Umayyad princes were murdered in cold blood after being deceived by an invitation to a feast. The Abbasids moved the capital of their new caliphate from Damascus to Baghdad. In 756, Abd al-Rahman I, a surviving Umayyad prince, fled to Iberia and established a renegade independent emirate in Al-Andalus. In 929, the Caliphate of Cordoba was declared independent from Baghdad, and its capital was established in Cordoba. By about the year 1000, the city of Cordoba had over 400,000 residents and was the largest city in Europe and the most powerful. The years 929 to 1031 were the golden age of Cordoba, including the building of the city of Medinat al-Zahra, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, 5 kilometers outside Cordoba. However, eventually civil wars led to the fall of Cordoba and the disintegration of the caliphate into what were termed taifas. You can see those areas on the map. These were independent Muslim kingdoms or principalities that rose in after the fall of Cordoba. Toledo was taken by the Christians in 1085, which then prompted a more extreme group called the Almoravids to invade. Then later the even more extreme Almohades invaded and forced the Christians back. Quite often, Moorish warlords allied with Christians to fight each other. The time of the Taifas was a time of great turbulence and a time of land grab by the individual kingdoms and principalities. A little more about the Almoravids. After the fall of Toledo in 1085, they were invited by the Taifa of Badajoz to defend Al-Andalus. They were Berbers, originating from Marrakesh, which they had helped to found in 1070. They defeated the Christian forces at Sagrajas in 1086. They were part of a religious movement called Murabitun, which meant ready for battle, and by 1094 they'd annexed most of the independent Taifas. I think it's fair to say there was less religious tolerance under the Almoravids, and indeed many Christians at this time left Al-Andalus and moved back to the Christian kingdoms. Then, in 1147, another North African civil war led to the downfall of the Almoravids and the rise of the Almohades. Almohad men were veiled, not the women, as depicted in the picture, and they originated in the Atlas Mountains. First they took control in North Africa before invading Al-Andalus, where they moved the capital to Sevilla. They believed that the Almohades had been corrupted by a soft, liberal lifestyle in Al-Andalus and invaded. In Sevilla, they built the Giralda Tower, a direct copy of the Kutabiyya in Marrakesh. You can see the two side by side in the picture on the screen. They began the construction of the Alcazar in Seville. In 1212, however, they lost a key battle to the Christian forces, a medieval NATO-style alliance of Castilla, Navarra, Aragon, Portugal, supported by crusaders and other military orders with the backing of the Pope. This was the famous Battle of Las Navas Tolosa. It was the beginning of the end as the country plunged into civil war. The Reconquista actually toiled 7 centuries, beginning with Covadonga in 718. Toledo in 1085 was a pivotal moment, but we know better than anyone that the key architect of the Reconquista was not Isabel and her husband Ferdinand. It was actually Charlton Heston, who captured Valencia from the Moors in 1094. In the famous film El Cid, Charlton Heston starred with Sophia Loren, and he was called the greatest hero of all time. Was he? Well, not really. He was a mercenary, and he fought for both sides depending who would pay him the most. We all remember the final scene in the film where the dead body of El Cid is put on a horse and sent into battle against the Moors, who were so terrified of him they ran away and swam back to Africa. In reality, away from the Hollywood fantasies, El Cid actually ruled Valencia for 5 years after the battle, until his death in 1099, and then his wife was ruler until the Almohades retook the city in 1102. Valencia was finally retaken in 1238 by Jaime I of Aragon, but we'll hear more of that later. The Battle of Las Navas Tolosa in 1212 was pivotal in the Christian advance. After that it was more or less one-way traffic as the Moors retreated towards Granada. From 1243 to 1492, the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada was a vassal state to Castilla and Aragon, and was only allowed to exist in return for taxes and providing military support to the Christians. In fact, in 1236, they helped the Christians to retake Cordoba. The Nasrid were Al-Andalusian and had no sponsors in North Africa. Until 1492, there were frequent wars, skirmishes, and a steady Christian advance south. On the wall of the Spanish Senate in Madrid hangs the famous painting by Francisco Pradilla, painted in 1882, The Rendition of Granada, 1492, the final surrender. In the scene, Boabdil, the boy king, hands over the keys of the city of Granada to Queen Isabel. Boabdil was allowed to leave Granada and establish an independent principality in the Alpujarra Mountains above Granada. However, after the opulence of the Alhambra, he only lasted a year before sailing to Fez with his 2,000-strong entourage. The surrender scene was recreated in the Spanish national TV series Isabel. What you do not see in that film is, as Isabel is receiving the keys from Boabdil, Ferdinand is at the same time slipping him a brown envelope with 15,000 gold pieces, which is about 6 billion euros in today's money. It was indeed the sale of the century rather than a simple surrender. Close to Granada is the Pass of the Sigh of the Moor, El Suspiro del Moro, which lies between the city and the coast on the motorway. Called such because there Boabdil turned and looked at Granada and wept as he left. His mother then came out with the immortal lines, "Do not cry like a child for what you could not keep as a man." Finally, to finish the historical context, I'd like to cover briefly the Moorish legacy in Spain. Middle-aged Europe from 600 to 1500 was a chaotic place, suffering wars, disease, plagues, famines. The population generally reduced by 25%, land cultivation was reduced, urban life declined, long-distance trade routes disappeared, and there was a general decline in literacy and scientific and intellectual knowledge. Meanwhile, in Al-Andalus, this was a virtual paradise in comparison. Moreover, Al-Andalus was a conduit for scientific and other knowledge to enter northern Europe. The Moors established schools of translators in Córdoba and Toledo. Ancient texts were translated from Greek to Arabic, then to Latin, and then filtered into the rest of Europe by a network of northern European translators, clerics and intellectuals. Much of the knowledge employed in the European Renaissance emanated from Al-Andalus. You can see how much from the slide. I'd like to focus on one area in particular which we can all see around us, and that is architecture. In a short lecture, it's impossible to do justice to the subject. I've chosen to look at the city of Marina outside Córdoba, the Mezquita of Córdoba, the Alhambra in Granada, and the Alcázar in Sevilla. Of course, there are many more rich examples elsewhere, especially in Toledo and Zaragoza. We first stumbled across Medinat al-Zahra on our first visit to Córdoba in 2016. It's about 5 kilometres outside the city and has an impressive visitor centre and archaeological site. It was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2018. It was built in the 10th century by Abd al-Rahman III, the Caliph of Córdoba. It was pure theatre designed to display the power of the largest and most powerful city in Europe. Ambassadors would arrive from all over the Mediterranean world and Northern Europe to pay homage to the Caliph, to bring him exotic gifts and to curry his favour. It contained the court and civil service of the Caliph. One of the largest libraries in the world was in Córdoba, with texts from ancient Greek and Latin translated to Arabic. The city hosted several mosques. It was visited by ambassadors from all over the Mediterranean world and Northern Europe, but was eventually destroyed by civil war and was only rediscovered accidentally by a farmer in the late 19th century. It is now a working archaeological site, as well as being a UNESCO World Heritage Site which you can visit. If there is one building in Spain that captures its rich architectural history, it is the Mezquita in Córdoba. Firstly, a Roman temple, a Visigoth church, a 4-stage Islamic mezquita, and finally, a Renaissance-style cathedral nave was implanted inside the mezquita. One wonders what could be there next. The Alhambra in Granada is a magical place, built by the Nasrid Emirate. The guidebooks refer to the Red Castle, but in fact it was white when it was first built, and it took its name from Nasr al-Hamar, the Red, the grandfather of Ibn al-Hamar, the Red, who built it. It was a citadel, housing the court, the civil service, and the Royal Guard, and at its peak had 3,000 residents, but interestingly no kitchen. All food was delivered from the city into the Alhambra. In a similar vein, the Alcazar in Sevilla was originally a Visigoth church, then converted to a military building by the Cordoba Caliphate. Development of the Alcazar was started in 1050 by the Almohades, who made Sevilla their capital, but much of the work that you can see today was completed by Christians after the reconquest of Sevilla in 1248. It is what is known as the Mudéjar style. The Mudéjar style takes its name from the many Muslims who remained in the Christian territories after the Reconquista, and continue with their unique building designs and methods, and indeed passed on those skills to future generations of Christians. Here are some examples of Mudéjar style from Valladolid and Teruel. The genre can be found all over Spain and as far away as Chile, Mexico and Colombia. The monastery in the first picture is Santa Clara at Tordesillas, and this occupies a very interesting part in Spanish history, as it was the place where Ferdinand ordered his daughter Juana, who actually was the rightful Queen of Castilla, to be confined. She was kept under lock and key for the best part of 50 years and was never allowed to reign. One thing we always call Islamic is the famous horseshoe arch, but just take a look at the picture on the right, which is from the 7th century Visigoth church at Santa Maria del Melque near Toledo, which was built 100 years before the Moorish invasion. The horseshoe arch probably originated in Persia and was taken from there by the Romans. Then the Visigoths saw it in the Roman Empire, imported it into Spain, and the Moors possibly took it from their incursions into Persia or took it from the Visigoths in Spain. So now on to the main star of the show, our warlord hero Azraq, born in the village of Alcalá de la Jovara, high in the mountains of the Valdebo. Alcalá today can be reached from Pego by taking the winding road up to the mountains, and then past the village of Valdebo and the Covarrull. Over time, the Marina Alta formed part of the Cordoba Caliphate, the Taifa of Denia, Taifa of Zaragoza, and the Emirates of the Almoravids and Almohades. Valencia was retaken by Jaime of Aragon in 1238, and close by Denia had fallen in 1244. Some say that Al-Azraq's mother was Christian. I've seen no evidence to support this. Others say she was likely a Nazarid princess from Granada. Again, I have seen no evidence. We do not know his precise birth date, but sometime around the birth of Jaime I in 1208. He was from an aristocratic family, the name Hudai being of Arabian origin. He was known locally as Al-Azraq the Blue, either because of his blue eyes or his blue turban. He was also known locally in Catalan as El Drac, which means the dragon. On the slide is the basic area he controlled over time. It is difficult to access even today with modern roads. 1,000 years ago it was virtually impassable. It was, however, a rich land with natural resources, water, agriculture in the terraces that the Moors built, and the rice fields at Pego. It was a self-sufficient stronghold. Lots of local villages still bear the prefix Beni in the name, which is Berber for son of. So places like Beni Arbej, Beni Chembla, Beni Dolej, and even Beni Dorm. 15,000 Muslims lived and worked in the area, and Azraq had a network of 18 castles plus watchtowers which controlled the inland routes to Hativa, Alcoy, and the routes from Valencia to Murcia. Our other main protagonist is Jaime I of Aragon, who was born in 1208, around the same time as Azraq. And incidentally, they both died in the same year, 1276. Throughout their lives, they had, let's say, an interesting relationship. At times hostile, but at other times there is evidence of an enormous amount of mutual respect from both sides, and almost an affection. Jaime is the longest reigning Iberian monarch, though the first years of his reign from 1213 were under a regency. When he finally assumed the throne fully, he started his crusade and he retook the Balearic Islands in 1232. You can see from the map he gradually made his way south, capturing key strongholds which controlled the surrounding lands and population. In 1238, he took Valencia on October the 9th, a day that we now celebrate locally as the Day of Valencia. On his statue in the Plaza Alfonso in Valencia, it is written, "He entered victorious in Valencia, liberating it from the Muslim yoke." Once Valencia was taken, he could move south to Alicante and Murcia, but that actually took him 6 years, as a very powerful adversary with a unique network of fortifications stood in his way. It isn't clear how many castles Azraq controlled at any one time, as they were continually being fought over. We know for certain about 8 castles highlighted on the map with a house symbol, as they are mentioned in one of the key surviving primary sources of the time, a peace treaty from 1245. They are Tarbana, Pop, believed to be near Merla, Benirama, Margarida, Castel, Beniaya, Benicilli and Perpechent. In addition to the castles were a network of smaller castellets and watchtowers. Together they represented a very powerful defence against the incursion of the Christian forces. A lot of ideas for this section on castles were inspired by a fantastic piece of work done by the Friends of Javea Museum, and in particular Michael Stevenson, who combined his hobbies of castles and walking by visiting virtually every castle site in the region, photographing them, drawing and writing histories. An exhibition was made some time ago in the museum, and all the texts are available on the museum website. Despite being a mountainous area, there are several approaches into it, but they were exceptionally well guarded. Firstly, a potential attack from the sea, which you can see on the left. The Aragonese had a very powerful navy due to their relationship with the Mediterranean and particularly the islands of Mallorca, Menorca and Ibiza. So an attack from the sea via Olivar was quite likely. The watchtower at Forna was the first line of defence, but then to reach the ultimate headquarters of Azraq in Alcalá, the invaders would have to climb significantly and go past the castle at Benirama at 236 metres and Benicilli at 516. The most popular route from Valencia to the south was via Alcoy, along what we know today as the A7 motorway. This was actually an old Roman road, the Via Augusta, and ran eventually to Cadiz. But what was wrong with what is now the AP7, so a route along the coast, you might ask? Well, the Autopista today is a marvellous feat of engineering with lots of tunnels and bridges. So without those, in the Middle Ages, it was quite an impassable route, with the mountains around the Bernia and the Mascarat blocking it, and it was very open to attack from the sea. If you look at the map on the right, you will see that to reach Alcalá from Alcoy, any invaders would have to pass by Planes and Margarida and through very mountainous areas. At this stage, a little more about medieval Muslim castles in general. The castle was central to an administrative district and responsible for protecting the population so that they could grow food, produce goods, and, of course, pay taxes. At the very top of the castle was a military square known as a Seleucia or Palatina. Lower down was an area for the civilian population and their animals to take shelter, the Albacar. Early castles were constructed using a compacted mix of mud and ballast known as taipal, using wooden frames to shape and compact the materials. These were quick and easy and cheap to build, but ultimately they couldn't withstand the Aragonese guns and cannons from the 14th century. Let's take the castle of Perpechent as an example. It was strategically important as it protected the inland route from Gandia through the River Serpis valley above Villalonga. The picture on the left is an aerial view of the ruins today, and on the right is superimposed the building framework of the castle, clearly showing the walls and towers. You can see the Seleucia on the top left and the Albacar to the right. Finally, a plan of the castle showing clearly the areas, the Palatina at the top and the large Albacar below to the right. I mentioned earlier a treaty signed in 1245. This survives today in the archives in Barcelona. It was called the Treaty of the Wells and was signed in Alcalá de la Jornada, April 16th, 1245. Both sides needed a truce. Jaime's attacks on the mountains were making little progress, and he was under increasing pressure from the French threat to the north of Aragon. The Moorish side was in an equally difficult position. Denia had been retaken in 1244 and Xàtiva had fallen. No help for Azraq would be forthcoming from Granada or from North Africa. Jaime sent his son Alfonso with a group of nobles to Alcalá de la Jornada to meet Azraq. The negotiations actually lasted several days, and apparently there was a lot of festivity until the agreement was finally made. The treaty was formed in two languages, Aragonese and Arabic. However, it does appear they were not direct translations. The Aragonese version talks about Azraq being a vassal of Alfonso, whereas in the Arabic version the word vassal, or its equivalent, never appears. Also, the dates on both versions are different, and it has been suggested that the Arabic version was added later as an addendum. In the agreement, Alfonso took over the castles of Tarbana and Pop for himself with all the income from those. Within 3 years, Azraq was supposed to hand over a further 4 castles at Benirama, Margarida, Castel and Beniaya. He was allowed to keep Benicili and Perpechent, but as a vassal of Alfonso and with an income split of 50-50. It was obvious that both parties had made the treaty just to buy time, and in 1247, 1 year before he was supposed to hand over 4 more castles, Azraq attacked Penaguila and took other castles in the south of the region. Jaime reacted very strongly to this. Against the wishes of his nobles, he ordered the expulsion of all Moors from his conquered territories. In reality, this was a disaster for the local economy, as the Moors were the backbone of agriculture and the various trades supporting the kingdom. Jaime had to back down somewhat, but his decision led to the importation of a lot of settlers into the region from Aragon, Catalonia, and particularly Mallorca. Even today, in remote villages of the region, a form of Mallorcan Catalan is spoken. It is shown what a significant player Azraq was because in 1249 Pope Innocent IV declared a crusade against him and decreed that any Christians helping him would be excommunicated. One more interesting moment during this time was that on March the 10th, 1250, Azraq wrote a letter to Jaime's second wife, Yolanda of Hungary, in which he proposed that diplomatic relations be established. Again, this letter survives in the archives in Barcelona. It is very polite and respectful. It clearly states his address, so he must have felt fairly safe. It's akin to Osama bin Laden writing to Michel Obama from his cave hideout in Afghanistan. At this stage, a diplomatic phase was entered into, but there were still skirmishes from time to time between the two forces, and they are marked by the positions on the map. Now a different Alfonso enters the story, the son-in-law of Jaime, Alfonso of Castile. As the Moorish territories broke up during the Reconquista, the different Christian kingdoms often fought over the spoils, and Aragon and Castile were actually on the brink of war between 1252 and 1256. Alfonso proposed to meet Azraq in Alicante in 1254. Alfonso asked Azraq if he liked to hunt, and he replied that yes, he'd like to hunt the castles of the King of Aragon, a phrase that came back to haunt him later. The Treaty of Almizra between Castilla and Aragon divided the region into spheres of influence and ended any possible cooperation between Alfonso and Azraq. It is clear that Alfonso was using this meeting with Azraq purely for leverage against Jaime. This diplomatic phase and stalemate ended in 1257 with the ambush of Rugat. The castle at Rugat can be seen on the left if you take the CV60 road from Gandia towards the A7 and Albacete. Legend has it that Queen Yolanda and Azraq actually became close pen friends, and that she persuaded him to take a Christian wife. He agreed and invited Jaime and Yolanda to his wedding, and their entourage was attacked on the journey there. Now Jaime got really determined and quickly took Planes, Castel, Benirama and Benicilli. It then appears that Azraq was betrayed by the man who controlled all the food supply for his main castle at Alcalá, which then ran out of food, and Azraq was forced to surrender at Alcalá in July 1250. He was then exiled either to Granada or North Africa. Jaime then wrote to his brother-in-law Alfonso, reminding him of his meeting with Azraq in Alicante, that now the hunter had been hunted. However, our story does not end there. Muslim resistance to the Christian advance continued. There was a large Muslim revolt in Murcia in 1260. There is no evidence that Azraq took part in that. What we do know is that in 1275 there was another Almohade incursion into Spain from North Africa, and it seems that Azraq joined that fight. In 1276 he marched an army on Alcoy, but was defeated and killed at the Battle of Alcoy, 23rd of April 1276. At one stage he appeared to be winning the battle, but the Christian forces were saved by the intervention of San Jordi or St. George, which is depicted on a famous mural on the wall of the Church of San Jordi in Alcoy. You can see that top right on the slide. Jaime remarked after the battle, recalling once again Azraq's meeting with Alfonso of Castile, that in the end Jaime himself proved to be the better hunter in the long run. The battle is reenacted each April in the Moors and Christians festival in Alcoy, said to be one of the finest in Spain. Azraq died on the 23rd of April, but on the 27th of July 1276, just a few months later, Jaime I died, almost as if he couldn't live without his lifelong adversary. Thank you for your attention.